Hoa Nguyen is here with us. Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
Thanks for having me. Thank
I
you.
think this is your first discussion, Modpo discussion.
I believe it is.
That's
yes.
great. Happy to have you here. And Laynie Browne.
Hello, good morning.
How are you, Laynie?
Good.
We're here to talk about two poems by Alice Notley. And it's from a collection, Songs and Stories of the Ghouls. And let's talk about them, starting with the one that is set in verse. And the first question for you, Laynie, is why does Alice read it so quickly?
Why does she read it so quickly?
Yeah, it really moves fast. When you look at, let me just say what is behind that question.
Okay.
When you look at the quatrains, you think quatrains, okay, well, let's pace ourselves. Quatrains tend to want us to hear the thing be assembled, and she moves through it quickly. I wouldn't say trance-like, but breathlessly.
That's really interesting. You said you wouldn't say trance-like, because the word that came to mind is trance in her reading style, but also it looks this way on the page within a collection of lots of assembled voices of ghouls to kind of distinguish it as a separate voice, I would say. So it looks visually different, but she doesn't read it stopping at the end of the lines, as you note.
Why does it make sense for us to ask about the relationship between a mesmerizing, enchanted idea of poetry and quatrains, which are traditionally not thought of as in that universe?
Well, I'm interested in the arrangement in quatrains and thinking about stanzas as rooms and thinking of this voice as sort of wandering through the rooms, and then, of course, going in between them, because the lines, are enjambed across the stanza break, so that there's a kind of continuous but also containment. But it's one in which where the paths are meeting up and not necessarily crossing or making sense, but maybe more labyrinthine. And I think that it's intentional that it's arranged in more of a classical structure, even as it's more wildly expressed.
In order to get us to think, at least for the moment, conventionally about what we expect and then defy those expectations?
Perhaps. I mean, it begins in the conditional, right? All these ifs. If you meet me, if I meet you, if I was your drug. So there's this kind of investigative and a proposal that's being made too by the speaker.
Let's each pick an enjambed couple of lines, an enjambment, and maybe read it and talk about the effect of it. Because enjambment, the end is not enjambed. The end is distinctly not. But before that, Laynie, you want to pick one?
Sure. I'll just start in the beginning. If you meet me here, I was lady. If I meet you where you were killed, then I'm no longer a civilian. So the effect here, there's a question about where is here, and there's a question about tenses, future and past, and what time and place the voice is speaking to and across, that seems deliberately tangled.
Yeah, the conventional grammar would be, if you meet me here, I would be or were, but it gets separated so that if you meet me here could be one idea, and then I was lady, if I meet you. It enjambs to cause 4 or 5 options for reading.
And it suggests that the lady or the speaker is somebody different in the different locations and in the different tenses.
Wow, you want to pick a
Well, I was
enjambment?
going to pick the next sort of, the next run where it goes across the stanza break. There's nothing to replace what you need from the soil, salted, it's perfect, your lady. And that's a sentence that's also like 2 halves, across that stanza break. Salted, it's perfect, your lady being 1 half, and there's nothing to replace what you need from the soil being the other half.
Modern or 20th and 21st century enjambment has been generally fabulous in allowing possibilities. The line ends and you could be okay with that, and then the line continues and a conditional changes everything. So why should I have one? If I met you without a conscience, why should I have one? That would be sufficiently complicated. Why should I have one when you're asking me to assuage yours, which is even more complicated? Can we talk about why, before we move to the prose poem, can we talk about why this poem ends with 2 end-stopped lines?
I was appreciating how the end-stopped lines that are also sound-shaped with dead and bad at the end of those end-stopped lines create a kind of shapeliness and a completion that is satisfying, especially after this sort of wandering discourse that's complex. Mm-hmm. I think it provides a sort of a place to land and a sense of a kind of moment that is a stoppage or is at least some kind of signal to a song.
Laynie, the second to last line, what does it mean? That's not a question. That's not a question I usually ask.
I know, it's so funny. Well, I mean, just to add to what Hoa was saying, I feel like the words dead and bad are somewhat closed, right? And so the period fits there, and it's in contrast to everything else.
It ends with a couplet, an end-stopped couplet.
We can't finish, but the gas is always free when you're dead is, I mean, I think it's funny, and it's a comment on the economics of life that don't make any sense. And when you're dead, the economics also don't make any sense because we don't need the gas when we're dead, but it's free.
And the very sound, rhythm, tone, and end-stoppedness suggests a kind of cracked truism. The gas is always free when you're dead, period. A saying. And then, of course, the next line starts to be a cracked saying, cracked truism, but then it ends with tone. Too bad. So let me ask both of you, who's the lady? What's going on? You know, this is Notley-esque, but for someone who doesn't know Notley, what do we want to say about this lady, capital L?
I was going to say lady, capital L. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're looking at each other.
Okay,
Laynie?
I'll go first.
Who's this lady?
I think we can read lady in a lot of different ways, and we'll also talk about it in the next poem, but the capital letter seems to me that it's some kind of mythical or divine presence, at least on one side or the other, either when living or when dead. There's some kind of a mythical or divine status or queenly status. Or it could be just put on by the speaker. Like, we don't really know, but there's so many possibilities for lady with a capital L.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it can be read as persona. It can be read as sort of an elevated figure that might be archetypal. It could also refer to mythic embodiment of goddessness or a divine feminine, capital L lady. Lady of the Wild Things I also think of, which is a kind of reference that we find in the next poem, who, you know, is an ancient figure.
Encounter with lady leads one away from the status of civilian. Mm-hmm. Civilian as in citizen of what world? What are we leaving?
The place where there is money.
Can you say more?
And gas.
And where are your allegiances? I feel like the poem is asking, where are your allegiances? Like, in the land of the living or the land of the dead? Because this is a book where ghouls are given voice. Or the dead are not dead. The dead have a lot to say, apparently.
Whose drug is whom? I'm no longer a civilian if I was your drug. I thought it would have been the other way around. I thought lady would be the drug that induces you away from mere civilian. Mm-hmm. Is it just a cool reversal? Or can we say more about that?
Can you repeat the way you just read it? You said that the way that
after
would be
the
more likely.
encounter, I meet you in a certain place that's sort of not where civilians hang out. And then I'm no longer a civilian if I was your drug.
It's a triple conditional. Mm-hmm. If I meet you where I was, lady, if I meet you where you were killed, then I'm no longer a civilian if I was your drug. So there's a lot that's entangled there.
How did she get to be Lady's drug if she's just entered the non-civilian state? It seems to be, I don't know, what does drug mean? The thing that creates sufficient intoxication and mesmerization to lead you away from the
Either
rational?
to make you want to stay living in one world or to help you cross into the next, either purposefully or not purposefully.
As a sort of psychopomp thing to help you cross over. I mean, I couldn't also help but, think of civilian in the terms of wartime versus someone, who is a soldier, because we do have killed in there as well. I can't help but think of the kinds of spirits that inhabit Notley's poetry across time, which include, that she directly invokes, which a brother who had died after serving as a sniper in the war in Vietnam and came back very changed by the experience and died, from an overdose. So
In white phosphorus, right?
Yeah.
And then in this book, that's so relevant because a lot of the ghouls who are speaking are victims of genocide in wars.
Good transition to the other poem, because the phrase deer hunter kept coming into my head, which is associated with a particular narrative about Vietnam, the Vietnam experience, having to do with home front shooting. But so it doesn't stand up to scrutiny, but it still makes me think of it. So let's turn to it. What's the role of the echo? After all, this is a poet. What's the role of the echo? Echoes are important here.
Yeah, I actually kind of bracketed this line. This is my echo from before, from what I had made for you vocally, and from before we acceded to the timeline, never like lace, lady, the mountain middle of no spatial universe.
There's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
Can we start with from what I had made for you vocally? Wow. What making is going on there? Is this poesis?
I think so. I think there's a way of like singing into being.
So is the speaker the muse for the mythical two-species creature?
Never like lace.
That's such a good answer.
This is my echo from before the encounter, before the transformation, from what I had made for you vocally, had made already before.
I kind of want to go back because that's the beginning. I mean, that's the middle, right? The echo is in the middle. And before that, so because this could refer to everything that comes before as well as a poem accumulates. So if we start with woman with antlers, deer-headed, antlered woman in black against black lace, black-headed deer woman, lady of the mountain. I have to stop. There's just too much there. Can we talk about the deer-headed, antlered woman with antlers and different associations?
Yeah, let's talk about the lady with the antlers. I mean, again, lady of the mountains whose antlers melt into lace. So a feminine embodied or female embodied figure that also has antlers, which are typically male, features, right, on a hart, on a deer.
Indeed.
So there's an interesting kind of intersexed, expression of this being. And then also, antlers develop across time. So there's also a relationship to time that's being set up here. And then something about voice and time as a construct, space-time.
And not only that, but cause and effect, because the lady of the mountains seems to have emerged from the right side of the speaker. So there is a birthing.
Or is she
Yeah,
a deer?
and I think there's multiple invocations with the deer-headed antlered woman, because there's invention and imagination of the poet. There's also Native American mythology, a deer-headed woman that has, just like you were saying, antlers. I'm not sure if that's what you were referencing, that are gold, but it's a female spirit with antlers of a male deer. And then Lady of the Mountains also could be a reference to in Icelandic poetry, or even a biblical reference like Mother Mary, Lady. So I feel like there's a lot being invoked there, but there's maybe a clash between something that's indigenous and magical and mythological with systems that are eradicating, indigenous.
What does it mean for this particular speaker to say, I'm not anthropomorphic?
Exactly.
Instead, insisting that she's actually soul of the mountain night, which is something very different. So
Right.
it's mountain night. So that doesn't quite, make sense in like a literal sense. Like, what is the mountain night? What does that mean? What does that mean?
There's a refusal here for poetry. I'm not going to do a likening between humans and animals. I'm not going to do an analogy in order to derive the naturalness of the animal world. I am not anthropomorphic. This is what it is. And there's this a little later, Lady of the Wild Animals, for whom the animals return. So that invokes many early human and indigenous tales of what happens in the spring. As things start to grow green, the animals who forage on them come back, and then traditionally, in traditional society, that meant the time when we could hunt animals because that's a source of our food. So, but in this case, they return for someone, a creature who is herself animalistic, for whom the animals return. Lady of Wild Animals, for whom the animals return. Does she entrance them too? Does she need them? Returning from where? These are all questions.
I feel like she's invoking an intelligence that is not human, that is not an animal in the sense that humans would understand if I see a deer walking in the woods, but a spirit, an animal spirit that is something not human, not animal, but an intelligence that's important to listen to that modern humans are ignoring.
I think she's also recalling Homer. Lady of the Wild Animals is the name that was given to Artemis, right?
Right,
Artemis.
Yeah.
Who was the hunting goddess who
Yeah.
was associated with the moon and women, but also was, important for animals, important for hunting.
Let's take a square bracket editorial critical insertion and try to enumerate some aspects of the mythical traditions. We just heard one tradition that Notley is interested in. We talked about Native American. Where are we in the history of human mythology here? What's being drawn upon? Is she creating a new kind of mythology for her own poetry? Is she overtly indebted to this particular tradition? Where does all this come from? And does echo have anything to do with repeating that tradition? Those are many questions.
I think she's deeply interested in voicing and the origins of language. And I feel like the question that she asks in this poem towards the end of it, do you hear the words of the conquerors?
Or.
Do you hear the voices?
So that or means
of deer.
We have options.
There's an opposition there.
So the conquerors, let's spell it out. The conquerors, the words of the conquerors would say what? Give us, be a conqueror for a second and say words.
Murder, take what you want,
Deer hunting.
This is just for our consumption. It's not alive. It doesn't matter. Just
Dominance over others, others as objects, land as object.
Yeah, and it's also in early 20th century, every early Disney attempt to do nature, this is the Disneyfied version of the conqueror, is the one who learns to live in nature, and then nature says, okay, you live with me, go ahead and take me. This is the opposite of that. So the alternative is hearing the voices of deer. So how would you describe the other side of that opposition?
not centering human intelligence as the most important intelligence necessarily.
And its relation to language?
Yeah, and I think as more of a vibrational space that doesn't necessarily have a locatable location, but it's a center of the echo.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that speaks to that these are all the dead speaking. So they're speaking from a non-place. They're speaking from a non-corporeal situation.
So listening. Listening is key here. Okay, so finding is also sounding, as in finding where the origin of a sound is. This is what we do with echoes. With the finder. Can you explain that? I'm finding with the finder. So is the finder also another creature, or is the finder something that I use, like an instrument I use to find?
I feel like here it's like a companion, I am finding with the finder. And it's a little bit, it goes back to, I think, the kind of chiasmic thing that happens in the opening lines. The woman with antlers, deer-headed, antlered woman, that chiasmic of antlers, woman, antlers, antlered woman, which forms, that X shape. And so there's a way in which finding with the finder, the path that leads from my head, but I'm also the center of it. It's not a logic that is linear. It's an unfolding. So I don't think it's intended to be necessarily a path.
It's also like the antlers are paths. The antlers pass leading from my head. So if you visualize that, it's like a birth emanating from the head of the goddess.
Here's a question for the two of you as poets. What does this do? What does Notley's exploration of this do for you as a poet? Are you willing to engage with this kind of poetic voice? Do you want to go there into the non-space? Does this appeal to your aesthetic? I know it does for you, Laynie. I know the answer, but I don't know why as well. I know your poetry, but what is appeal? I think a lot of people watching this conversation are going to think, this is really cool, but this is not like a lot of other poetry that we talk about.
Mm-hmm. Well, Notley is a poet that can speak with and through the dead. And this book is, I think, making an argument that the dead aren't dead. And there's a lot that we need to listen to. In other words, just because somebody was murdered in a war doesn't mean it's over. It's not over. It goes on for generations, and the people embodied now need to listen.
So now define echo in that regard. Echo is the sound of those who are not here because they made the sound, and we can hear. If we have our finder with us, we can find the sound. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And you're attracted to that idea that the sounds of the world can't die if we just learn to listen to them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's great.
And why?
Because there's more than what we can know with our senses, or that we can understand in a purely intellectual, material way. There's so much more than that. And poetry is a language that can investigate.
Which is what poetry has, after all, been all about, and why it is different from so many other kinds of uses of language. So why not? Wow, what are you thinking?
I'm kind of just the same. I kind of just stayed, this attention to what's beyond the ordinary senses, the belief that the dead are among us, that we can connect and listen to them with the right kind of centering, echoing. The deer with the heart or breath line through the mouth to the center, echoing. I think is a really powerful moment in the poem for me that encapsulates this idea of like listening and also of return.
So what are the conquerors missing?
Everything.
Yeah, so let's make a list of what the conquerors are missing. Because there are conquerors in the world of poetry, of course. This concept of maybe no poet that we particularly admire, but the idea of using language to pin things down, to name things, to identify things, to objectify things, to make things include in the poem, and in the name of enlivening them, wind up deadening them, right? This is a very different concept of poetry than the poetry that does such a good job of identifying things in the world, especially historically. So I started us off. What are the conquerors missing in the poetry sense?
Sacredness of life, not all human life, but not just human life.
Wow.
What are the conquerors missing? Well, I think the words of the conquerors are as a kind of attention to dominance and thingifying, right? So, and also the sort of like a linear construction of time. So I think what they're missing is everything that exists outside of that linear construction, which is quantum mechanics or other philosophies that are looking at the universe as a process, for example, and not actually singular events and objects, I think is what they're missing.
Time and place as well, as you've pointed out earlier. When we think of conquerors, we think about land acquisition or territoriality. And this is not the kind of place that's going to work.
Yeah, and going back to that question of what inside of Notley's poetics that I'm drawn to, I think it's exactly that spaciousness that allows for these other possibilities of voicing.
Final thoughts. What did you want to say this morning, Laynie, that you didn't get a chance?
My final thought is that on the last page of this book, she writes, the poem, always my real country. So like the poem as a location for excavating the real beyond what we can...
National boundaries.
Yeah, and what we can see materially or make an argument for logically.
Well, final thought?
Yeah, I'm also interested in this, that the entire is called Songs and Stories of the Ghouls. So the idea of these animated spirits that maybe also are restless, that are storytellers and singers that we can attune to.
My final thought has to do with the last line of the 3-quatrain poem, which is, really great tone and funny and maybe goes in a slightly different comic direction. There's no money where you meet me, too bad. So where the conquerors are and where the civilians are, it's got to be remunerative, or why act? And this is the opposite of that. There's no money. This is not about getting something back, gaining, advantage taking. So there's no money where you meet me, too bad. And too bad is just fabulously ironic. Laynie, Hoa, thank you both. This was a lot of fun. This was great.
Yes, thank you.